Titled Tuesday, May 2nd, 2023, and it is at the final round. Alireza Firouzja and Hikaru Nakamura are both in the running for first place, and they are paired against each other. Firouzja has the white pieces, Hikaru Nakamura has black. Let's jump right in and see what happened. Alireza begins with d4. Nakamura plays knight to f6, and then Firouzja plays this. Knight to c3. Could it be? He is preparing to play the Johnnyballgame London system? Well, here's what happens. Hikaru plays e6, and now e4 is played by Firouzja, and after d5, we've transposed into a classical French defense, still a very unbalanced and sharp game. e5 hitting the f6 knight, the knight moves. This is the Steinitz variation for white. f4, and you get this classic French structure with the locked center. White usually wants to arrange the move f5. Black will attack the base of white's pawn chain at d4 with c5. c5, knight f3, knight c6, continuing to put pressure on d4. Bishop e3, developing and defending d4. And now rook to b8. This is like the fifth most commonly played move in this position, but it's perfectly good. Basically, he's preparing to advance the b pawn and even get it to b4 if possible, with the rook behind it to give it some force. a3 covers the b4 square. The bishop won't be able to pin, and also it could limit this pawn's advance. a6, continuing the queenside expansion. Queen to d2 and b5, just as we said. Now here, Firouzja takes on c5 to keep those pawns from being an avalanche on the queen side. Bishop takes c5. So in this particular structure, this d4 square is at the heart of everything. Basically, if one side can control that square, they could have a real advantage. What white wants, what Firouzja wants in this position, in a perfect world, is to keep this structure and have a knight sitting on that square versus the, change of color, the light squared bishop for black. That's like the perfect arrangement of pieces for white if he can get it. Bishop takes c5, knight takes c5. This knight could, of course, jump into e4, cause some problems. So b4 is played. Not only does that reduce the mobility of black's queenside pawns, but it also forces this knight on c5 to make a decision. And he retreats the knight to d7. He could go into e4, but after takes and exchanging queens, in this position, this creates something of a fractured pawn structure. This pawn on e4 is vulnerable, and white has a healthy pawn majority on the queen side. So instead, Nakamura retreats the knight back to d7, bishop to d3, the natural developing square, and of course black does not want to castle here because the Greek gift sacrifice is very powerful. Queen d3, entering into h7. If he plays g6, then just the queen shifts to h3. That would be bad news. So Nakamura plays a novelty. He plays the move f5, but in the past, queen to b6 was played. f5 to block this bishop's diagonal. And of course, if he takes en passant, the knight would just retake, and black would have a decent position. So knight to e2 is played. After this structure becomes even more locked after f5, the d4 square gains even more importance. It really becomes a dominating force because a knight on this square could attack this pawn on e6. The knight goes to b6, can go to c4 or a4. The knight goes to d4, a knight trade. Right now, Firouzja threatens knight to c6, which would fork the queen and rook. So bishop to d7 covers that. Castles, castles. Now, how does white attack this structure? Where does white get their play? We see this is a very locked structure with this pawn on f5. Well, the way white attacks this structure is by arranging the move g4. Now, that can make people a little nervous at first because, well, they're afraid they're exposing their king. And they are, but the truth is it's just the only way to really attack this structure. White has to find a way to arrange g4 and develop pressure on the g file and maybe even play f5 after the pawn exchange. So Firouzja plays king to h1. Preparing to play rook to g1 and advance on g4, rook to c8, rook to g1, and now queen to h4. Basically, trying to use the queen for purposes of prophylaxis to reduce white's potential on the king side and make g4 harder to achieve. g3 is played at first. The queen goes to h5, keeping this g4 square under his eye. Queen to f2, with a little discovery threat, by the way, against that knight on b6, which then moves to a4. And now bishop to e2. hitting the queen. And again, you see all of these moves that Firouzja is playing is an attempt to arrange g4, and Hikaru is trying to prevent it. We can see they both see that as the strategic key to this position. Queen to h6, so after g4, the f4 pawn might be vulnerable, but g4 is played by Firouzja finally. Pawn takes, rook takes. So this pawn isn't hanging at the moment because it's defended by the queen and the rook. Knight to c3, hitting the bishop, so the bishop decides to go to d3 on a nice attacking diagonal, the one it was on earlier. Knight to e4 blocks that bishop. Now here, taking the knight is trouble, because if this light-squared bishop could get on this diagonal with this king more exposed, that could be big trouble for white. So he definitely doesn't want to do that. So the queen moves to e3 as it was under attack. Rook goes to c3, pins the bishop at d3. It can't take the knight because the queen would hang. Now rook a to g1, continuing the strategy, doubling on the g file, aiming at g7, g6 to limit those rooks, and now h3. Now I have to be perfectly honest, I don't understand the move h3. I don't know why Firouzja played it. I'm sure he had a good reason. He's a substantially stronger player than I am. Maybe it was to give this king some room in case Hikaru got pressure on the light square diagonal. That's my best guess, but I'm not 100% sure why he played it. Rook takes a3, king to h2. He doesn't move his king off the light squares. King to h8, and now knight to f3. The knight can go to g5, but also it supports a rook move to h4, putting some pressure on the h file and hitting the queen. The rook comes back to c3, and now the rook does go to h4. The queen retreats to g7, and now queen to d4. A very well centralized queen with threats of taking the knight, followed by queen takes rook. Rook f to c8, doubling on the c file and protecting the rook on c3. And now knight to g5, obviously threatening rook takes h7, check. So black chops that knight off. And in this position, Firouzja takes with the rook. Computers prefer picking with the pawn, actually, so that white can play rook f1 and use this f6 square as a strong anchor point for a rook. And that would give white quite a bit of very nice play in that case. But he takes with the rook. Bishop to e8 to help defend g6. Queen to b6, double attack on a6 and e6. Queen to e7 defends this e6 pawn. Now, it looks like white should just take on a6, but actually black would give up the exchange with rook takes c2, and now this king would be far too vulnerable after bishop c2, rook c2 check, king h1, d4, and essentially all black has to do is get on this light square diagonal, and white is just completely lost. So this is just a winning position for black, as it turns out. So instead of taking that pawn, Firouzja doubles on the g file, h6. Now this rook is trapped, but Firouzja already was aware of that. He gives up the exchange for a pawn and a bishop. And so he does have quite a bit of activity around the black king. So what Hikaru does, because he obviously sees that Firouzja's attack is really scary, is he plays rook takes bishop. He gives back the exchange in an attempt to try to create some problems for white's king. Pawn takes rook, now queen to h4. What he wants to do is play the rook to c2 and then just meet at the quarterback, mate that white king. So Firouzja plays really easily the strongest move on the board, queen to e3. And the reason this is a strong move is because it covers all of the queen's potential checking squares after rook to c2 check. It helps defend the white king. Rook to c2 check. Now rook to g2 is played, blocking. Rook g2, king g2. And now we have an endgame of queen versus queen, but it's still very complicated with lots of pawns on the board. A lot left to be played here. The queen goes to e7, aiming at the b4 pawn. Then Firouzja plays queen to c5, saying, let's exchange queens. But the problem with exchanging queens is that in this particular position, you can see I've drawn the square of the pawn. And if this black king is outside of that square, they cannot get inside the square, then it can't stop the pawn from queening. It's not close enough. So this would be a win for white. The pawn would just queen, and black could not stop it. So instead, queen to f7 is played by Hikaru. King to f3 defends that pawn. Queen h5 check. King e3. Queen to h3 check. So black does have some material here. King to d4. And there's no check on this diagonal. That would be great, but that doesn't work. Queen to f5. Queen to c8 check. King to g7, queen to d7, and queen to f7. So now there's either the exchange of queens or queen takes f4 check. But you can't really exchange the queens because of the power of this h-pawn. So he has to play queen to d6. Now queen to f4 check. And it looks like black is getting the edge here, that Firouzja is in some trouble. Well, let's see. King to c5. Queen goes back to f7. Now queen a6, getting a pawn back. Queen to c7 check. King takes b5. And now both pawns have been recaptured. And now we have even pawns in an unbalanced structure. Queen takes e5, gaining another pawn. Queen to a7 check. King g6, queen g1. And we see a sequence of checks, an offer of an exchange of queens, which he does not accept. h5, king a5. Obviously, there's a race between the h-pawn and the b-pawn. Who will get there first? h4, b5, queen to a1 check. King to b4, h3, queen to c7 check, king to f6, b6. Now you just have to watch out for potential checks from behind. Queen to b2 check, king to a5, h2, one square away from queening. Queen to f4 check, king to g6, and in this position, there is a repetition. It would be a perpetual check, and there would be no way that black could get out of it. As it turns out, as soon as we entered this queen versus queen endgame, it was actually even the whole way. Even though it looked like one side was gaining the edge over the other, it was even. And with this draw, Firouzja did finish a half game out of first, and Hikaru finished tied for first for this titled Tuesday. I hope you enjoyed the game, and we'll see you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.